Winter on the American frontier did not arrive gently. It arrived with force, silence, and consequences. In the northern Rockies during the late 1800s, winter was not just cold weather. It was a long audit of every bad decision a man had made during summer and fall. Most settlers believed they understood cold. They built cabins the same way their neighbors did. Above ground, thick logs, big fireplaces, raised floors. From the outside, these homes looked solid and respectable. They looked like progress. But winter exposed a hard truth those designs couldn't hide. They leaked heat everywhere. Wind pushed through gaps in logs. Cold air poured up through floors. Fireplaces pulled warm air straight up the chimney faster than families could replace it. Men burned wood all day and still woke to frozen water buckets. Children slept in lofts near the ceiling because the floor was too cold to touch. Living space shrank to whatever the fire could reach. This wasn't bad craftsmanship, it was bad logic. The cabins were fighting winter head-on, and winter was winning. Every cord of wood burned came at a cost. Trees had to be cut in bitter cold. Logs hauled by hand or sled. Wood split when iron rang brittle from frost. The work never stopped. The colder it got, the more fuel it demanded. Many families survived winter exhausted before spring ever arrived. Some didn't survive at all. What killed people wasn't sudden exposure. It was the grind, the endless labor, the sleepless nights tending fires, the mistakes that came when bodies were tired and fingers numb. Most settlers accepted this as normal. Winter was supposed to hurt. That's what they told themselves. But one man saw it differently. Silas Brennan had spent years living in winter camps, where resources were scarce and mistakes were fatal. He didn't have the luxury of burning wood non-stop. He learned early that survival depended on reducing loss, not increasing effort. He noticed something others ignored. Cold air moves. Heat escapes upward. Wind steals energy faster than fire can replace it. Most cabins were designed as if heat was infinite and labor was free. Neither was true. Silas understood that winter didn't need to be defeated. It needed to be managed, controlled, slowed down. And he understood something else that few settlers ever questioned. The ground beneath their feet was warmer and more stable than the air they were building into. Winter exposed a lie the frontier had learned to live with, that suffering was unavoidable. Silas Brennan wasn't willing to accept that. Silas Brennan didn't learn about cold from books or builders. He learned it the only way that mattered, by living through it when mistakes had consequences. Long before he owned land in Bitterroot Valley, he had spent winters moving trap lines through the Rockies, sleeping where the land allowed and burning only what he could carry. Those winters taught him something most settled men never learned. Cold is not defeated by effort alone. In the backcountry, you don't get to burn wood all night. You don't get to waste heat. If your shelter leaks warmth, you don't survive long enough to complain about it. Silas learned to read the land the way others read blueprints. He watched where snow drifted and where it didn't. He noticed how earth held warmth long after the sun was gone. He felt the difference between wind-chilled air and still ground. He learned that exposure isn't just about temperature. It's about time. A man can endure extreme cold for hours if he's protected. But let that cold work on him day after day, pulling heat from his body, stealing sleep, demanding constant labor, and eventually something gives. Judgment slips. Tools get dropped. Fires are mismanaged. Accidents happen. Silas saw strong men fail not because they were weak, but because their shelters forced them to work too hard just to stay even. When he finally settled near other homesteads, What surprised him wasn't how cold the winters were. He expected that. What surprised him was how much effort people accepted as normal. Families burned through massive wood piles and still lived on the edge of freezing. They treated exhaustion as proof of toughness, not as a warning sign. Silas didn't see toughness, he saw inefficiency. He had lived in temporary winter shelters, low, partially dug in, protected from wind that stayed warmer with a fraction of the fire. He had slept on ground that never froze solid, while raised floors above ground turned into ice. He knew from experience that Earth was not the enemy people believed it to be. Moisture was the enemy. Wind was the enemy. Poor airflow was the enemy. Earth, when handled correctly, was an asset. Silas also understood something builders often missed. A home wasn't just a structure, it was a system. Heat, air, moisture, and labor were all connected. If one part failed, the rest followed. So when the time came to build his own place, Silas didn't copy what others were doing. He didn't try to improve their cabins. He started from a different question entirely. Instead of asking, "How do I build a strong cabin?" he asked, "How do I stop losing heat in the first place?" That question would lead him to a decision that made sense to a trapper, but sounded foolish to nearly everyone else. Most settlers thought of the ground as something to escape from. Dirt meant damp. Earth meant rot. Cellars were for food, not for living. The common belief was simple. If you wanted to stay warm and dry, you had to get up off the ground. Silas Brennan knew that belief was wrong. He had slept on frozen ridgelines and in shallow dugouts. He had felt how fast wind stripped heat from raised shelters, and he had learned something basic that most people never tested for themselves. Below the frost line, the ground doesn't get colder. No matter how brutal the winter air becomes, the soil several feet down stays almost the same temperature year-round. In the Rockies, that meant the earth held steady in the high 40s. That wasn't warm, but it wasn't deadly cold either. And more important, it didn't change. Silas understood stability. Trapping had taught him that predictable conditions mattered more than extremes. A steady 48 degrees was better than a room that swung from 80 near the fire to below freezing by morning. Most cabins were built like sieves. Wind pushed under the floor. Cold air pooled at ground level. Heat rushed upward and escaped through the roof. Families tried to solve this by burning more wood, but that only treated the symptom. Silas wanted to remove the problem. The ground offered 3 advantages no above-ground cabin could match. First, wind protection. Earth doesn't leak, it doesn't flex, it doesn't allow drafts. A wall backed by soil blocks moving air completely. Second, thermal mass. Once Earth absorbs heat, it gives it back slowly. It doesn't cool off the moment the fire dies. It holds energy and releases it on its own time. Third, insulation that costs nothing. No logs to haul, no boards to saw, no walls to stack higher and thicker. The land was already there. But Silas also knew the ground could kill a man if he treated it carelessly. Water trapped against wood would rot it. Moist air left unchecked would turn a shelter into a moldy hole. Poor drainage would flood everything come spring. That's why most earth shelters failed. Not because the idea was bad, but because the execution was lazy. Silas wasn't planning to live in the dirt. He was planning to work with it. He chose a hillside that naturally shed water. He paid attention to slope runoff and soil composition. He didn't want groundwater pressing against his walls. He wanted gravity carrying it away. Where others saw a hill, Silas saw insulation, windbreak, and temperature control all in one. That decision alone separated his thinking from nearly everyone around him. While the valley kept building taller and burning harder, Silas was preparing to build lower and lose less. And that choice, quiet, unremarkable on paper, would make all the difference once winter stopped being theoretical and started being real. When Silas Brennan finally started building, the reaction was immediate and negative. People didn't need to see the finished structure to make up their minds. The moment they saw him digging into the hillside, they assumed he had lost his sense. Frontier logic was straightforward. Real homes stood above ground. They faced the valley. They showed confidence. A man who buried his shelter looked like someone preparing to fail. Silas didn't argue. He kept digging. Instead of stacking logs upward, he cut 8 feet into the slope. 3 sides of the shelter would be backed by earth. Only the front would face open air. The roofline stayed low. The entrance dropped down before reaching the door, forcing cold air to settle before it could reach the living space. To experienced builders, this looked wrong in every way. They warned him about collapse, snow load, rot, smoke buildup, flooding during spring melt. They told him the ground would sweat moisture into his walls and ruin everything he owned. They said the roof would fail, the entrance would trap him, and the fire would either smother him or burn the place down. Some called it dangerous, others called it foolish, a few called it shameful. Silas heard all of it and kept working. What the critics missed was that Silas wasn't improvising. He was solving specific problems one by one. Wind couldn't reach most of the structure. Cold air couldn't flow freely through it. Heat wouldn't escape quickly because there was nowhere for it to go. The shelter didn't need to be tall because warm air didn't need room to rise. It needed to stay. The entrance wasn't straight because straight entrances act like funnels for wind. His sloped trench worked like a trap, letting cold air sink before it ever touched the interior. The roof didn't need a steep pitch because the earth covering it distributed weight evenly. Snow load wasn't pressing down on beams. Alone, it was supported by soil that naturally carried weight. This wasn't guesswork. Trappers had used similar principles in winter camps for generations. Silas was simply scaling those ideas into something permanent. What made people uncomfortable wasn't that the shelter might fail. It was that it rejected everything they believed a proper home should look like. Frontier society valued visible effort, tall walls, big fires, heavy timber. If a structure didn't demand constant work, people distrusted it. Silas was building something that asked for less fuel, less labor, less exposure. And that threatened more than building traditions. It threatened the idea that suffering was proof of doing things right. As winter approached, the valley waited for him to admit defeat. Most expected him to abandon the shelter once real cold set in. Silas moved in quietly. He didn't prepare excuses. He didn't prepare backup plans. He prepared to let winter speak for itself. Silas Brennan didn't have drawings pinned to a wall. He didn't calculate loads on paper or talk in technical terms. What he had was a clear goal stop wasting heat. Everything he built served that purpose. The shelter wasn't a single idea. It was a system. First came drainage. Before any walls went up, Silas made sure water would never sit against the structure. He laid river stone beneath the floor and along the base of the walls, creating clear paths for moisture to move away. Water follows gravity. Silas made sure gravity worked for him. Next came separation. The earth-backed walls were not bare soil pressed against wood. He lined them with vertical logs and left a narrow air gap between the earth and the timber. That gap mattered. It broke the path moisture would take and slowed heat transfer. It also gave damp air somewhere to move instead of soaking into the walls. Then came insulation. Silas didn't use anything fancy. He packed the gaps with dry pine needles, grass, and moss materials he could replace each year. They trapped air. Air doesn't move heat well. That was enough. The front wall was the only part exposed to the valley. He built it thicker than anything else. 2 layers of logs with packed fill between them. Then he set it back behind a low earth berm. Wind hit dirt first, not wood. Cold air was forced up and over instead of straight in. Inside, the heating system mattered more than anything else. Silas didn't want a big fire. Big fires burn fast and waste fuel. They overheat one corner of a room and leave the rest cold. He wanted steady heat, so he built a masonry heater. The firebox was small. The stone mass around it was large. Smoke didn't rush up and out. It traveled through channels inside the stone, giving up its heat before escaping. Once that stone was warm, it stayed warm for hours. That meant 2 fires a day instead of 1 fire every hour. The floor followed the same logic. No air gap, no cold drafts underneath. It sat directly on the ground, tied to the Earth's stable temperature. It never froze. It never burned feet. It stayed consistent. Ventilation wasn't ignored. It was controlled. Warm air rose and left through a dedicated vent. Fresh air entered slowly near the door. Nothing rushed. Nothing stagnated. Smoke moved when it needed to and nowhere else. None of this was complicated. It was deliberate. Silas didn't build bigger. He didn't burn harder. He didn't chase comfort through force. He reduced losses first. That's what separated his shelter from every cabin around him. Others tried to overpower winter. Silas closed the gaps winter used to win. By the time the first serious cold arrived, the system was complete. Not impressive to look at, not loud, not proud. Just ready. Winter would decide whether that was enough. The real test didn't come with the first frost. It came when the valley stopped warming up between cold spells, when the ground locked hard, when wind stayed for days and the temperature never climbed back above 0. That winter didn't ease in. It arrived all at once. Cabins that had handled cold before began to struggle. Fires burned day and night. Woodpiles shrank faster than planned. Men stopped measuring time by daylight and started measuring it by how often they fed the fire. Sleep came in short shifts. Someone always stayed awake. Inside most homes, the pattern was the same. The air near the ceiling was hot. The floor was bitter cold. You could feel the heat pulling upward, leaking away, while cold air crept in from below. No matter how much wood went into the fire, the balance never held. People noticed something else, too. Silas Brennan wasn't hauling wood every day. His chimney smoked, but it didn't roar. The smoke was thin, steady, not the heavy black plume of a fire fighting for control, but the quiet sign of something burning efficiently. At first, people assumed he was just tougher, used to cold. Maybe he was suffering in silence. Frontier pride made that believable. But the cold kept coming, and Silas didn't change his routine. While others rationed fuel, he still walked the valley without a heavy coat. While families crowded around fires, Silas moved easily, unhurried. He wasn't begging for shelter. He wasn't borrowing wood. That raised questions. When the first visitor finally stepped inside his shelter, the difference was immediate. Not a blast of heat, no wave of smoke, just even warmth, the kind that didn't push you back or dry your throat, the kind that filled the room quietly. The thermometer told the rest of the story. Mid to high 60s, steady, not for an hour, not after feeding the fire, but all day. All night. The fire itself was small, no flames climbing, just a bed of coals. The stone around it was warm to the touch, not burning. Heat radiated outward slowly and evenly. People checked the walls. Dry, no frost, no dampness. The floor wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. You could stand on it without numbing your feet. The math didn't make sense to anyone still burning wood the old way. Less fuel, less effort, better results. By the time the cold reached its worst, the question was no longer whether Silas's shelter worked. The question was why no one had tried it sooner. Winter had settled the argument without saying a word. Once people stopped arguing and started paying attention, the reasons became clear. Silas Brennan's shelter didn't succeed because of one clever trick. It worked because every part supported the others. Most cabins focused on heat production, bigger fires, more wood, larger fireplaces. The assumption was simple: if your cold burn more fuel. Silas flipped that logic. He focused on heat retention first. Wind was the biggest enemy, and his shelter removed it almost entirely. 3 sides were backed by earth. The entrance didn't face the valley winds. Cold air had no straight path inside. Without wind moving through the structure, heat stopped bleeding out. Next came temperature stability. Above-ground cabins swung wildly, hot near the fire, freezing by morning. Those swings exhausted people and materials alike. Silas's shelter barely changed. The ground moderated everything. The stone stored energy. The room stayed within a narrow range, no matter how ugly it got outside. Then there was airflow. Traditional cabins leaked air everywhere. Uncontrolled drafts pulled warm air out and dragged cold air in. Silas controlled the exchange. Warm air exited where he wanted it to. Fresh air entered slowly and predictably. Nothing rushed. Nothing stagnated. Fuel efficiency followed naturally. Because heat stayed put, Silas didn't need large fires. Because fires were small and hot, they burned cleaner. Because the masonry mass stored energy he didn't have to feed the fire constantly. 2 burns a day replaced a lifetime of fire tending. That wasn't comfort by modern standards, it was freedom by frontier standards. The floor told the same story. In other cabins, cold pooled at ground level. People avoided the floor because it stole heat from the body. Silas's floor was tied to the earth below the frost line. It never froze. It never shocked bare feet. It stayed consistent, and consistency mattered more than warmth alone. Moisture, the fear everyone warned him about, never became a problem. Water was handled before it reached the shelter. Drainage worked. Airflow carried humidity out. Earth didn't cause dampness, poor design did. Every failure people predicted depended on something Silas had already accounted for. The truth was uncomfortable for experienced builders to admit. They weren't wrong about materials. They weren't careless about workmanship. They were wrong about priorities. They built cabins to look solid and familiar. Silas built a shelter to solve specific problems: wind loss, labor, and fatigue. That's why it worked. Not because it was radical, but because it was honest. It didn't pretend winter could be beaten with strength alone. It accepted winter as a constant and designed around it. Once people understood that, the shelter stopped looking strange. It started looking inevitable. The hardest thing for experienced men to do is admit they were wrong. On the frontier, reputation mattered. If you were known as a builder, a mason, or a man who knew winter, your word carried weight. Admitting a mistake meant admitting that people may have suffered because of it. That's why Silas Brennan's shelter didn't change minds overnight. At first, people explained it away. They said his hillside blocked the wind better. They said he was tougher than most. They said he didn't mind the cold. Excuses were easier than rethinking everything they believed about building, but excuses don't survive numbers. As winter dragged on, men started comparing woodpiles. They compared how often fires were fed. They compared how tired they felt. And the gap kept growing. When experienced builders finally stepped inside Silas's shelter during the worst cold of the season, they came prepared to find flaws. They looked for dampness, they checked airflow, they examined the stonework. They expected smoke problems or hidden danger. They didn't find any. What they found was calm. The fire wasn't loud, the air wasn't stale, the walls were dry. The heat didn't hug one corner, it filled the space evenly. The thermometer didn't lie. The temperature stayed where other cabins could only reach with constant effort. That moment mattered more than any argument, because these men understood materials. They knew what rot looked like. They knew how smoke behaved. They knew when something was being staged. And this wasn't staged. It was a working system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Some of them stayed quiet afterward. Pride demanded that much. Others asked careful questions, not out loud at first. They measured distances. They counted stone courses. They asked how often the fire was fed. They ran the numbers in their heads. The answers bothered them. Silas was using less than half the wood and getting better results. He wasn't pushing his body to exhaustion just to stay warm. He wasn't gambling on luck. He had removed winter's leverage. That realization changed the tone of the conversation. The shelter stopped being a joke. It became a case study. The experts didn't suddenly praise Silas. Frontier culture wasn't built that way. But something shifted. Criticism faded. Curiosity took its place. Men who once mocked the design began sketching it quietly. Builders started experimenting with smaller changes. Better wind protection, thicker floors, improved airflow. No one announced a revolution. They didn't need to. Winter had already delivered its verdict, and the men who understood winter best were the ones who could no longer deny what they had seen. Silas Brennan never tried to convince anyone. That was part of why his idea survived. He didn't hold meetings. He didn't explain theory. He didn't argue with men who had been building cabins longer than he'd been alive. He answered questions when they were asked and stayed silent when they weren't. On the frontier, that mattered. Men trusted what they could see and verify for themselves. And winter kept providing proof. By late January, visitors stopped coming out of curiosity and started coming with notebooks. They measured the depth of the excavation. They paced off the entrance trench. They counted how many times the fire was fed in a day. They paid attention to the things that actually affected survival. Most didn't copy the shelter exactly. Some only took one idea. A builder added an earth berm to block wind on the north side of his cabin. Another lowered his floor closer to the ground and sealed the underside. A few replaced open fireplaces with stone heaters that held heat longer. One man dug a recessed entryway after realizing how much cold air rushed through his door every time it opened. No one announced they were following Silas Brennan. They just stopped doing things that didn't work. That's how practical knowledge spreads, not by pride, but by pressure. Wood consumption dropped in homes that adopted even part of the system. Nights grew quieter as fires didn't need constant attention. Families stopped crowding into lofts. Floors became usable again. The change wasn't dramatic from the outside, but inside it was obvious. Spring came, and for once people weren't broken by winter. The following summer told the real story. Instead of cutting extra wood out of fear, families planned more carefully. Instead of rebuilding damage from the cold, they improved what they already had. Labor shifted from survival to preparation. By the next winter, the valley looked different, not in appearance, but in behavior. Fewer massive fireplaces, more controlled heat, More attention paid to airflow and ground contact. The idea that suffering was unavoidable had lost its grip. Silas's shelter didn't become a standard blueprint. It became a reference point, a reminder that tradition isn't the same as truth. The men who adapted weren't the ones who wanted innovation. They were the ones who were tired of wasting effort. They didn't want clever ideas. They wanted results, and results were undeniable. Silas stayed where he was, expanding the shelter slowly as his needs changed. He never claimed credit. He never corrected anyone who borrowed the ideas without mentioning his name. That didn't matter. What mattered was that fewer people entered winter afraid. And on the frontier, that was the closest thing to success anyone could ask for. Years later, people would talk about Silas Brennan's shelter as if it were an invention. It wasn't. There was no single moment of inspiration, no breakthrough trick. What Silas did was simpler than that. He paid attention. He looked at what winter actually did to people and asked why it kept happening. He didn't confuse tradition with effectiveness. He didn't mistake effort for intelligence. And he didn't assume that the way things had always been done was the best they could be done. That mindset mattered more than any stone wall or heater design. Frontier life rewarded visible strength. Big fires, big structures, big labor. Those things looked impressive, especially to men trying to prove they belonged. But winter didn't care about appearances. It punished waste and rewarded efficiency. Silas understood that survival wasn't about fighting harder. It was about losing less. His shelter didn't make him invincible. He still had to cut wood. He still had to tend fires. He still respected the season. But winter no longer controlled his life. It didn't drain him day after day. It didn't force his family to live on the edge of exhaustion. That was the real victory. The lesson spread quietly, but it stayed. Later builders wrote about masonry heaters. Others talked about earth contact and wind control. But those were details. The deeper lesson was simpler and more useful. Build for the problem you actually have. Most settlers thought their problem was cold air. It wasn't. Their problem was heat loss. Once Silas identified that every decision followed naturally, the frontier rewarded people who could adapt without pride. Men who changed their minds survived longer than men who defended bad ideas out of habit. Winter didn't argue. It just kept coming. Silas Brennan never set out to change how people built. He wanted a place that worked. Everything else followed from that. That's why his shelter mattered. Not because it was clever, not because it was hidden, but because it solved the right problem. And that lesson still applies. Whether you're building a cabin, a home, or a life effort, alone isn't enough. Efficiency matters. Observation matters. Humility matters. Winter will always find the weak points. The question is whether you fix them or keep feeding the fire and hoping for a different outcome. That's frontier wisdom.